Okay, adding a podcast to a site is actually the same exact process, more or less, as we went through in adding a blog. You log in to the admin area, of course, and then click on the content management icon, and then you'll see a link that says Manage Podcasts, and you will see that the interface is more or less identical to the interface of adding a blog. So I'm not going to go into quite as much detail here, but the rules kind of remain the same. You can add as many podcasts to a particular site as you want, and every podcast has a specified user as its owner. I'm going to add a podcast. You give the podcast a name and an alias. In this case, the alias would work in the same way as the blog, so that you have your site URL /podcast/ whatever this alias is. So if I called this podcast podcast 1, then it would be my URL /blog /podcast 1, and that's how I would get to the podcast on the front side of the site. You select your owner. You select which site this podcast is going to belong to. You publish or unpublish it. Access public or restricted. Again, that's whether or not you have to be a registered logged in user when you access this podcast on the front side. Commenting works in the same way as we've gone over before. If you have questions, go back to the blogging tutorial and it will work the same way. Same thing with subscription for RSS. Now here it's a little bit different. It's just simply how many episodes do you want to offer on the front page, and then of course from that point on they will be paginated, and so users will be able to use either the tools like the podcast archive or the pagination to find other podcasts. So if I say, for instance, 5 and I have 20 episodes, then there will be 5 per page, and there would be 4 pages of 5, and the users would be able to scroll through those pages. That's what we mean by pagination. And then do we want to have a podcast header or not? The same thing as the blog, so you can reference that tutorial if you need to clear that up, but you can use this WYSIWYG editor to add an image or text to create a header that will always be seen at the top of the front page of the podcast. And then once you've created your podcast, you simply save it, and that would add the podcast to the system, and of course the podcast would belong to the site that you had selected and to the user you had selected, and now you've got a podcast that you're ready to begin adding new episodes to. Now, one other thing I had mentioned is this podcasting tool is fully iTunes compliant, and when you go to iTunes, they will walk you through a process of how to add a new podcast to iTunes. And the one thing you will need is you will need a link back to your podcast that you provide to iTunes. And so to know what that link is, find the podcast on your list. So in this case we have this podcast named Buzzcast. I click on that one time, and now look at the top here. It says iTunes link, and I can select that full link. I can now press Control C. That's a copy command in Windows. If you have a Mac, you could press, I believe, Command C, but you use your hotkey to copy that, or perhaps you could simply right-click and press Copy. Okay. Now that you have selected that and copied it, you go to iTunes, and where they ask you for the link, you paste it into there. That's all you need.